Let's start by shattering a massive myth in revenue cycle management. There's this dangerous misconception floating around that simply submitting a clean claim with a valid CPT code somehow guarantees you protection from post-payment audits. Well, it doesn't. Welcome back to Part 9 of our Explainer series, Decode Healthcare with Harshal. We are shifting gears today from skin substitute pathways to dive deep into the actual data behind rising debridement and graft denials. We're going to unpack the root causes and figure out exactly what it takes to safeguard a practice.
This right here is the ultimate core equation you need to remember for 2026. Correct CPT plus weak documentation equals a denial, or even worse, a recoupment. Having perfectly valid codes means absolutely nothing. And I mean nothing to pre- or post-payment auditors if your clinical justification and medical necessity are nowhere to be found in the chart. You could literally have the most accurate coding in the world, but if the documentation doesn't actively back it up, you are essentially just handing that payment right back to the payer.
So here's our reality check. Today's denials, they're rarely driven by simple data entry errors or typos anymore. Instead, the data shows us they are heavily driven by inadequate procedure descriptions, missing surface area dimensions, and an overarching failure to demonstrate documented improvement. In 2026, it is no longer just about picking the right code from a list. It is about building an absolutely impenetrable wall of clinical necessity.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll cover the top payer audit triggers, what auditors actively review, high-risk compliance pitfalls, run through a real-world audit scenario drill, and finally, lock in the 2026 audit defense rules.
Section 1. Top payer audit triggers.
The source materials highlight 7 main tripwires that will instantly put a target on your documentation. It starts right at the basics. Having no documented necrosis, or maybe billing a deep excision code when the documented depth really only supports a surface code. Then there's the math. Auditors are absolutely checking for missing or mathematically inconsistent square centimeter measurements. Beyond that, red flags will fly if you're performing routine weekly debridements or applying skin substitutes without proving the wound bed was prepared or that objective improvement actually happened. And finally, excessive, unverified grafts, those will instantly ring alarm bells for any reviewer.
Let's look a bit closer at trigger number 2, the depth rule. It's really a clear line in the sand. Selective debridement, your 97597 or 97598, is strictly for surface, non-viable tissue. But the documentation insists that the absolute moment you excise deeper into subcutaneous fat, muscle, or bone, you must substantiate the 11040 series codes. For example, billing an excisional 11042 without explicitly proving in your notes that subcutaneous fat was excised, that's a direct, fast-track pathway to a denial.
Now, one of the biggest dangers outlined in the research is essentially the clinical definition of insanity, performing routine, weekly debridements without documenting any measurable improvement whatsoever. If the healing has totally stalled, but the treatment strategy never changes week after week, CMS is actively hunting for that exact pattern. Continuing the exact same intervention without an update to the strategy when healing plateaus is practically begging for a compliance review.
Section 2. What auditors actively review.
According to the audit guidelines, reviewers want to see active clinical thinking, not just a procedural task checklist. Your charting has to tell a full, cohesive story. What was the initial state of the wound? What was the thought process behind the clinical decision? What were the exact details of the procedure? And what was the final clinical outcome? If a note reads like a simple checklist of completed tasks, an auditor is going to instantly question the medical necessity of that visit.
This all builds into a very specific, logical, clinical progression. Auditors expect hard proof that basic, conservative management was attempted and failed before you jump to advanced interventions. From there, they're looking for precise measurements recorded consistently at every single encounter, explicit documentation of the tissue types excised, think slough, Escher, or devitalized fat, and finally, clear, objective improvement to justify repeating the procedure at all.
Section 3. High-risk compliance pitfalls.
We really need to translate these auditor expectations into action because falling into specific documentation traps acts as a massive, glaring warning signal to payers. Hitting these known pitfalls almost guarantees that a chart is getting pulled for a deep dive clinical review.
The sources identify 4 main traps to eliminate. First, the identical notes trap. Let me tell you, the copy-paste keyboard shortcut is definitely not your friend here. Clone charting your progress notes week after week is a massive risk. Next is the continued debridement trap, which happens when you rely on boilerplate phrasing like wound debrided today, but provides zero supporting clinical narrative. Then you absolutely have to avoid the unprepared bed trap, which means applying expensive biologics before documenting that the wound bed was actually ready for them. And lastly, the stalled care plan trap. This happens when a provider completely ignores the plateau in healing without revising the care plan or even explaining why the delay is happening in the first place.
Section 4. Real-world audit scenario drill. To really ground these abstract rules, let's walk through a real-world scenario where a clinic actually loses payments for 6 consecutive debridement sessions. Why did it fail? Well, the failed audit featured pure boilerplate notes. They completely missed the surface area dimensions and failed to mention specific tissue types. The auditor simply stamps medical necessity not met and recoups the payment. Conversely, look at a compliant passing narrative. It explicitly details the anatomical location, gives the exact size in square centimeters, details the specific non-viable tissue removed, and even lists the surgical instruments used, like a scalpel or curette. That is the exact level of detail required.
Section 5. 2026 Audit Defense Rules. Let's resolve this compliance tension and arm you with what you need. Distilling all these guidelines down, your defense relies entirely on 3 foundational rules. 1. Consistently validate medical necessity by linking the exact CPT code to the precisely documented depth and surface area. 2. Record those meticulous measurements and explicit tissue types at every single visit, no exceptions. And 3. The ultimate question your documentation must answer for the auditor: did this treatment truly move healing forward? If your notes don't definitively prove the answer is yes, it simply shouldn't be billed. As we wrap up today's explainer, the source material leaves us with a really provocative question to chew on. Who is the ultimate compliance gatekeeper in your practice? Is it the provider or the coder? It's a fascinating debate, and that answer perfectly sets the stage for our Part 10 series finale. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and keep decoding healthcare with Harshal.